All right, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Awesome. First off, I'm just blown away. I don't know how often you say, hey, I'm going to give a nerdy discussion on music theory, and you get like half the church to stick around. So I don't know what you all think is going to happen here, but don't hold your breath. This ain't no concert. No, the purpose for this, Pastor Chris started doing some little post-service workshops back in the fall, and asked me if I would have any interest in doing something like that. And I said, that would be great. I've been a music educator for a large portion of my life, and I think anyone who's ever worked with me knows that it's not something I can turn off. And so given the opportunity to just do it without having to apologize is lovely. With this one, I was kind of thinking about like, what would be a good way to teach the congregants, the people in the church, more about music, but in a way that encourages participation. I think that's the big thing, is I wanted to create a sort of music theory for the church singer. Because everyone that attends is a church singer. Everyone in church is encouraged and invited and asked to sing as part of the congregation. And there's something wonderful that happens when we put our voices together like that. And it's truly beautiful, and it is the Spirit and God moving. But I also know that a lot of people are very apprehensive and are very nervous or self-conscious about putting themselves out there. It is a little scary to open your mouth and sing and be. It's easy to be self-conscious about it. And sometimes some of those fears or concerns or anxieties can be alleviated by just knowing a little bit more, understanding a little bit more. And so I'm going to try to. I'm going to do my best not to run on for too long, because I know folks are going to want to eat lunch afterwards. But so I wanted to begin with a sort of overview, music theory, music terminology, to sort of demystify some of the hieroglyphs that some of us, if we're not trained in how to read music notation, it can just look like a bunch of dots and squiggles, and somehow this turns into music. And so I wanted to kind of discuss a little bit of that and then get into our hymnal. And that's, again, I wanted to really focus the talk today on everything that I say I want to have connect to this, because this is how we all sing together in church each week. Every now and then I put little inserts in the bulletin, and I have guest singers and musicians and people that play, but this is for all of us to join in worship, and this is how one of the ways that we can participate. So I passed out a sheet. It should have a front and a back. I succeeded in making the copier put on both sides of the paper and saved a few trees. And again, I'm going to kind of blow through this, but this is sort of a glossary for you guys. You get to keep these. You can take them with you. If you've studied music before, a lot of this is going to be very, very, very much review and stuff you already know. But it's amazing when you're reviewing things, how many times you come across something you're like, oh, I never even really thought about that, and now it's nice to address that. So if you look on the first page, which says Music Notation and Theory Overview, I wanted to introduce some of the symbols and the notation that we come across when we're dealing with music, whether it's in our hymnal or in sheet music. And so with music notation, what we try to do is find a way to write down and express music, pitches, notes to play, music to play. And how do we do that in a written notation? Any written notation, whether it's different languages, all have this struggle that they have to do. In music, we use what's called a staff. A staff is 5 lines that go across. Now, it didn't used to just be 5 lines. It's sort of coalesced into that over time as music has developed. Early on, even the very, very beginning, early music notation, they realized notes go up and notes go down. And there's higher pitched ones, there's lower pitched ones. And how can we represent that? Well, let's do a visual. And so think about like a ladder, going up and down the rungs of a ladder. And so they start off with a bunch of lines. What's cool with music, and this is something for everyone to take note of, we can put notes on the lines. We can also put them in spaces. So if you look across those first 2 lines that I have there, you'll see that some of the notes have the line running right through the middle of the note head. Other ones kind of fit in between 2 lines. They're in what we call the space in between. And so in music, we put notes on other lines or spaces. Once we set up that system of 5 lines, that doesn't tell us everything. What we need to have is a key. And the key that we use is a clef. And that word clef has the same origin as the word for key. And so when we put a clef, which is if you look all the way at the far left, you'll see the treble clef, and then the line below it, the bass clef. It's a little squiggle, and those little squiggles denote which line is going to be an A and which line is going to be a D. And we use the letters A through G to talk about our pitches in music. We stop at G, we go back to A again. So there's just 7 distinct letters that we use in determining that. But the clef that we put on determines which line and which space is going to be which letter. Now, as someone singing in church from your hymnal, You don't need to know if a note is an F or an A inherently. It can be very, very wonderful to know, and again, the more that you explore this stuff, the more confident you'll feel with it. But the big thing is paying attention. What I love about music and music notation is the visual element of it. If you look at the third line down, I tried to kind of indicate that. We have, as I mentioned before, notes can go up, they can rise, they can ascend, and notes can descend. And when notes are going up, you can hear it. The pitch is working its way up. You can imagine Looney Tunes going up the stairs or coming back down the stairs. Notes can move in stepwise motion. And when we're moving in stepwise motion on a staff, we're going from a note on a line to a note on a space to a note on a line to a space. So that's why those first two examples on that third line, you see stepwise ascending, stepwise descending. And you can see it's going line, space, line, space, space, line, space, line. Just to the right of that, then we have skipping ascending and skipping descending. You'll see that when we're doing the skipping, the notes are all on lines, or we could skip from one space to the next. And when we skip in music, instead of going stepwise, you can hear yourself walking. You can hear that we're not hitting every note on the way. We're kind of hopping over certain notes. And so again, when you're looking in your hymnal, if you see a bunch of notes and they all stay on the same line for a while, you know you're going to be singing one note for quite some time. If you see the notes that are going up, you know your voice is going to have to rise up with it, and similarly if they're going down. When you see big jumps in the music between from one note to the next, you will hear, and as you hear it happen, you'll be singing, and you will be making those large leaps. And so again, there's a huge element of music notation that I find to be very, very accessible to all people. Even if you don't know if that's a G or an A or a B, if you see that it's going up, you can have your notes go up. And it's amazing how much this works. And I've worked with some phenomenally talented singers that straight up with me like, Brian, I don't read music. And it's like, really? It always kind of blows my mind. But they can still look at the music and they can see the contours of the shape of the line that they're singing. And it can help them out. And so I encourage all of us, especially people who don't read the notation, oftentimes I'm just going to read the words here. I'm going to focus on the text. But if you just peek your eye up, you'll start to make some of these connections. I can say this as someone who when I was probably 3-4 years old, my older sister was taking piano lessons, but the piano teacher said I was too young. And so I had to teach myself how to read music. And so I did it when I was like 4 or 5 years old. And so it's very, very accessible. It's very intuitive. And I did it just from listening to her lessons and reading in books and just kind of matching things up. Now, so that's the pitch part of music. That's the high low notes, the low notes. We also have rhythm in music, and that's another key component. So the first part of rhythm that I addressed, and I never know which way to go on this because there's interplay. I started off with talking about meters or time signatures. And then I went on the top of the second page, you'll see rhythmic subdivisions. They're totally intertwined. Rhythm is a huge part of music. It's how we carve up time. That's what's happening in music. When music is in time, is we have a steady pulse, and then we divide it into other pieces. You see, each one of those, you still felt that steady pulse, but I divided it into different number of subdivisions, and that's how music works. So, starting with the time signatures, you will see, and this is one of those ones that those of you who have taken some piano lessons at some point in your life, or played flute in the school band, or sung in a choir, are going to look and be like, time signatures, I got time signatures, that's a piece of cake. It tells you how many beats there are in a measure. It's true. There's two numbers, though. The top number tells us the number of beats per measure. So if I'm in 4/4 time, which is the first example there, there's 4 beats per measure. 1, 2, 3, 4. But if I'm 3/4 time, there's only 3 beats per measure. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. 4/4 time is what we would also call common time. You see a couple further down there, you see just a letter C, and that's common time. 4/4 is the most common time signature in the world. That's why we use common time for it. If you're listening to music, if you're like, I wonder what meter it's in, assume it's in 4/4 because you're usually right. Everything else are the aberrations, the exceptions. 3/4 time, fairly common, not nearly as common as 4/4. 3/4 time would be waltz time. If you remember doing your box step and your waltz, you're dancing to 3/4 time. Later on, you see there's 2/4 time, only 2 beats. Oftentimes that would be used in a march situation because you got 2 feet when you're marching. So you got your left and your right, and you're back to your left and your right. Then I mentioned common time. Cut time is a little variant on it's a mix of 4/4. It's really what cut time does is puts you in 2/2. So in cut time, even though there's 4 beats, you're feeling a bigger 2 within it. Now, that's all showing what the top number is. But there's this bottom number. And across the board, that first line, it was all 4s on the bottom. But then you see the next line down, I started putting 8s on the bottoms. And then the very bottom line there's a 3-2 with a 2 on the bottom. So, does anyone know what the bottom number of a time signature tells us? What do you got, Pete?
The value of the note.
The value of what note?
The time value of each individual note in the measure.
Nope, because you can have all sorts. I can be in 4/4 time, but I can have eighth notes and I can have half notes. So, Ivy, you got it?
What kind of note it is, whether it's a half note, quarter note.
So, everyone's dancing around it. Which kind of note equals 1 beat? That's the key. So when you have a 4 on the bottom, that means your quarter note is equal to 1 beat. When you see an 8 on the bottom, you'll see on that second line there, I had 6/8. Those guys, when you get them all beams together, those are called eighth notes. And you see that there's 6 eighth notes in that bar. And then the one next to it with the 9/8, there's 9 eighth notes. When I go all the way down to the bottom line there, the 3/2, there's 3, and the 2 on the bottom means that half notes are equal to 1 beat. And so that's one of those kind of funny things where I've had countless students who can play really, really well. And I say, hey, what's the bottom number of a time signature? Hey, it's number of bars per line. No, that's not right. Is it? No, that's not it either. It's one of those things that you can get away with doing music your whole life and never actually put that all together. But that's what those numbers are telling us. As I mentioned, when we go to the top of the backside of the page, we've got our different kinds of notes. I've used the term whole note. I've used the term half note. I've used the term quarter note. I've used the term eighth note. You can see even when I go further, 16th notes. And you'll see that these are all like fractions. And in fact, that's exactly what they are. Each note is cutting the previous ones in half. So I had a whole note add up to 4 beats. So if I'm right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's a whole note. If I want half notes, 1, 2, 3, 4. If I want quarter notes, eighth notes, 16ths. The next one would be 32nd notes, but I can't do that with octaves in one hand at that tempo. And you can go to 64th notes. I remember playing a Beethoven sonata, and in the opening of it, there were 128th notes. That's the fastest ones I've seen. But it was really slow. The tempo is super slow. It's this one. And so it's super, super slow. So those 128th notes, they fly, but they're at least manageable. And that's another thing to keep in mind with our rhythms. We're always dividing up time, and I've used this term beats. Beats are like seconds. In fact, when I set my metronome to equal 60 beats per minute, a metronome is a little machine that ticks at a certain given pace. So I set it to 60 beats per minute, and when I do this, if my metronome is properly calibrated, it is ticking exactly the same speed as the second hand of a clock, because there's 60 beats per minute. But I can also make my metronome go faster. Now it's at 104, or I can make it go a lot slower. And you'll see it's steady the whole way, but a different tempo. So rhythm is us dividing up the beats. Tempo is how fast those beats come. If tempo is quarter note equals 60, your beats are all exactly 1 second long. Does all that make sense? Piece of cake? Great. I'm going to do a couple more pitch things, then we'll open up our hymnals. So we see, some other things that for us to be aware of. If you look at that top line, when you see that big old fat note that doesn't have a stem attached to it, doesn't get colored in, that whole note, if you're singing in the hymnal, you see one of those, take your time. We're going to be there for a minute, because that's 4 beats. Whereas if you start seeing the ones that get all beams together and connected, those are going to go a lot faster. And so that's a good kind of reference point for you. What we also come across are ways to alter these notes. I mentioned how we have 7 letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we're back again. However, there are actually 12 distinct pitches within an octave. So we have to have some modifiers to hit some of these other notes along the way. And so what we use are what are called accidentals, or sharps and flats. Sharps are the ones that look like the pound sign on your phone. Kids these days call them hashtags. And the flats are the ones that look like little letter B's. A sharp makes a note go up. So here's a G. If I were to play a G sharp, oh, it's a little higher. I'm going to go back to G. Oh, I can hear that G sharp was just a little bit higher. Or here's G, I can go to G flat. Got a little lower. Back to G, G flat. Now, There's two ways that we will see and come across accidentals. One of them is in what's the second line of that page, are in the form of key signatures. And so what that can do is you can open up the hymnal to, we'll open up. Let's open up to 294, because I'll talk about that one in just a moment. But just to show you an example of a key signature, 294, here we gather as God's people. You'll see the very, very start, there's only one staff on this one. That's very interesting. We'll get to that in a moment. But we've got our treble clef, and just after our treble clef, you see those two sharps. They're not next to any note. They're just out front like that. It's called a key signature. When you see a key signature like that, when you're singing in church, you're fine. You don't have to do anything to worry about. You just sing. I'll be playing in a certain key, and your voice will find that key. It's lovely. When we're in tonality, it pulls you there. It's hard to go against tonality. So when there's a key signature, it can be tricky for the people playing the instruments. None of us really like seeing 6 flats or 6 sharps in a key signature. It always kind of inspires, oh, wait, C flats, shoot, oh, goodness. But when you're singing, don't make no difference. In fact, some of you will probably have realized, I'm sure many of you haven't, that I don't always do the songs in the key in the hymnal. Why don't you do that, Brian? Sometimes it depends on who's singing, who the cantor is. If Noreen is singing, she's a soprano. If my wife Lauren is singing, she's an alto. And so if I put the same song in the same key for the both of them, it's either going to be perfect for Lauren and really low for Noreen, or perfect for Noreen and really high for Lauren. And so I will modify those keys a little bit depending on who's singing. Or if I'm the one that has to growl out a song on a given week, I'll put it in a key for myself. But again, you guys, many of you don't even realize unless you have perfect pitch or strong enough relative pitch to kind of account for that. What you want to be aware of, though, is accidentals that get written into the music. So when you're going along, all of a sudden there's an accidental, a sharp or a flat or a natural right next to a note. I'll show you an example. If you turn the page 295 in this very room, go to the 4th line down there, 4th system, where you see the words "quite enough power," and you'll see in the treble clef part a little natural sign next to the note, and then the bass clef part a flat next to another note. When they get written next to specific notes like that, that's where it's going to affect you. And that's where you're going to feel when you're singing, when you start to see sharps, flats, naturals occur in the music, you're going to hear the music change. Because what those accidentals do is they take us out of our key temporarily. They move us to a different tonality. And so when those creep into the music, it will affect how you're going to sing that note if you're singing that note. If you're not singing that specific note, you'll still hear this other note. You're like, that's a cool sound. I haven't heard that one during this song yet. And oftentimes it'll take us to a slightly different harmonic location. So again, sharps, flats, naturals. When you see them in key signatures, as a singer, you're cool. You just sing. You sing with the music. All is good. If you see them written next to a note there, you can expect that note. If it's sharp next to that note, you can expect it's going to be a little higher than the last time I sang it. And if it's a flat, it's going to be a little lower than the last time you sang it. Just a last little sort of category of music notation that can affect us as singers, as church musicians, I like to call these musical roadmaps. And that's the sort of bottom part right here. So you see the first one is a repeat sign. When you see those 2 lines and there's those 2 little dots, it means we're going to go back and do it again. We had done a song last week. What was it? 187? I nailed it. 187. And I pointed out to you that, hey, there's repeat signs here. Blessed are the persecuted. We both have a repeat sign at the end of the verse, and then repeat signs around the refrain, which meant that we did each one of those sections twice. Those are repeat signs.
I have a question for you.
Please, Ginny.
You said when you introduced this song that the repeat sign needs to go to verse 2. I don't think so. I think it means you have to sing verse 1 twice and then the refrain twice and verse 2 twice and the refrain twice. Am I right on that?
It's dealer's choice. Take your pick.
I didn't know you had a choice on that.
Yep, dealer's choice.
I just meant repeat.
Yep. And so that's why when we were doing that song in church last week, since when I'm at the organ I get to be the dealer, I was like, hey, this is what we're gonna do. You could repeat verse 1.
We'd still be here. We'd still be here singing.
Oh, yes. You have to repeat it each one. Yes. Right.
But yeah, so
I knew why you did it, but I always thought that it meant repeat what you just sang.
I've heard it both ways. So You can go either way with it. The last sort of roadmap stuff I'm going to introduce to us. One of them, I was delighted because we were doing church this morning. One showed up for us. Turn to number 600. Jesu. You'll see on this one that when you get to the bottom of the page, and we sang this, and we all did a great job with it, and Noreen did a good job leading it, and we talked it through. You'll see at the very, very bottom, last measure, Jesu, slave to them, you'll see the letters DC, not District of Columbia. This DC stands for da capo, or from the top, from the head. So there are a few different ways that we can have if we want to repeat a section in music, but we can't just put those two little dots. I want to repeat that part, but it's over there. I don't know, how do I get over there? There's a few ways to do it, and they're related to one another. And I kind of put them down here, sort of side by side. There's a front end of it, and there's a back end of it, and there's variants. So we can have a DC, which is da capo. When you see that, you go all the way back to the very beginning, very, very top. Or you can see a DS, which is del segno, which is from the sign. And if you take a look next to that DSL code on our page, there's that funny, it's like an S, there's a line through it and a couple of dots. That's the sign, that's the segno. So if you see a DS, you go back, you got to find that funny squiggly little S, and it jumps you back there, and you sing from there. That's if you don't want to go all the way back to the beginning, but I want to go to this one specific spot. Then, the back end of those, so either da capo takes me to the top, DS takes me to the sign, but then there's this al fella, and then he takes us either to a coda or a fine. So who is this al? Well, al is just saying you're going from the capo, from the top, or from the sign, to, and then we either go to a coda or a fine. In our example of 600 Jesu, we had a fine. And if you look at the end of the second line, which is the refrain, just above that last measure, you see the words fine. And it's not saying you did a fine job with that hymn, it's saying fine, the end, it's over. Also, you'll see that that bar line at the end of that line has a really thick bar line. And that's another indication of the end. Whatever the final bar of a piece of music, we give it that extra thick one. That's sort of saying, you made it, you're here. So it's sort of a redundancy with the fine. But so our DC, al fine in this instance. Or we can have a DC al coda. A coda is like an ending sequence of a song. And oftentimes it's not just, we're just going to finish out the refrain. There's a little extra stuff. We might tag something. We might have a new idea that comes in. And we need another chunk of music just to end it off. And so we call that section the coda. You can see in the picture that I have, it kind of came out small. I apologize for that. It sort of looks like if you were like shooting a bow and arrow and you're looking through the sight. It's like a little target, bullseye kind of a symbol. That's your coda. So if you see a DC or DSL coda, you go, and at some point it's going to say, hey, go to the coda, and you got to go find that little bullseye, and that's where you pop in, and then you take it from there to the end. Awesome. So there's, again, what I think are a lot of music symbols and notational devices that are used, and I didn't get into everything. I spared you the double sharps and the double flats. We didn't get into with the time signatures. I threw a 7/8 just for chuckles, but we didn't delve into 13/16 and the finer nuances of compound meter. But these are the things that I think that as someone who's singing in church and reading from a hymnal, some of these things can just help us to be a little bit more comfortable and have a sense of what's going on. Now, I also wanted to get into the hymnal, because the hymnal is not your standard sheet of music. It has more information in it. It's a really useful tool, especially for someone like me. There's lots of little details in here that can make doing worship easier, smoother, more fun, and inspiring. So we're going to turn back to number 294, which I mentioned earlier. Here we gather as God's people. And there's a few things we're going to bounce around a little bit. We're going to start at 294. And so this hymn is called Here We Gather as God's People. That's the name of the hymn. Hymn names are based on the lyric or text of the hymn. If you look at this hymn, you see, Here We Gather as God's People, has a number, 294, just to organize things. And then we see the music. We talked about eighth notes and quarter notes. Oh, I can see there's some stepwise motion, some skipping. Great. All these great things that we talked about are starting to make sense. You also see on this one, there's just one staff. We talked about that earlier. It's just a treble clef, as opposed to a lot of the hymns have multiple staffs. And on this one staff, there's only one note at a time, whereas a lot of hymns, there's two staves, and they both have like two notes at a time on them. So this one is what's called a unison hymn. We all sing this one together. There's no harmonized out parts. It's intended for everyone to sing together. You can see it's only one verse. It's sort of an introit-ish type of a gathering song. But there's a few other bits of information here. So if we take a look down below everything, we see words, Daniel B. Merrick from 1991, and then music, Wyatt's Repository of Sacred Music, Part 2nd, 1813. The words were from 30 years ago, and the music was from some repository from 200 years ago. That happens a lot. As I said, the hymn is the text. But when we write a hymn text, we want some music to sing it to. Sometimes, whoever wrote the hymn text will write a song to sing it to. And other times they're like, I'm not feeling inspired today. There's probably a really good song out there somewhere, though. So how do they figure out what to do with it? Well, they need to find a lovely hymn tune. And they need to find a hymn tune that's appropriate to them. And this is where we're going to turn over. And this is kind of the focus, because I think this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily pay attention to. And when you do, you can kind of, if you're like me, you can go down a rabbit hole with the hymnal, chasing these things through. If you look at the bottom, below the last measure, all the way on the right, you see the word Nettleton that's written in all capital letters. And underneath that, it says 8787D. That's the crux of what makes this hymn work. So, two parts there. Nettleton. What is Nettleton? Nettleton is the hymn tune. So, here we gather as God's people, identifies the text that we sing. Nettleton is, and you'll recognize this, that melody is the tune Nettleton. Now, what then does that say about the 8787D? The 8787D is the meter of this hymn tune and this hymn. What do I mean by meter? I mean quite literally syllables. The first phrase has 8 syllables. The second phrase has 7 syllables. The next phrase has 8 syllables. The next phrase has 7 syllables. You are welcome to go through and count. It adds up. You will find little variants where sometimes they don't. This is one of those instances where one of the things that I always look out for, and if I catch one, I'll give my singers a heads up. Sometimes in hymns, the word power is 2 syllables, but sometimes it's only 1. Sometimes the word heaven is only 1 syllable, but sometimes it gets 2. And a lot of times those little elisions are meant to make the meters work out, to make the syllable count add up. Well, okay, Brian, but 8787, and I only got to the end of that second line. What's this D all about? The D says it's more 8 sevens. You just do it again. It's a shorthand for instead of writing 87878787, it's 8787D, and that D basically says double what you just did. The next 2 phrases follow the same thing. All right, now I mentioned how this is written as a unison hymn, but we've done this one before, and you're probably like, but Brian, you played other notes. So where'd those other notes come from? And the answer is the last one, which you'll find in the hymnal, not every hymn has all the pieces of information, all these little details, but certain ones have certain things. Before we get there, it just caught my eye. If you go over to the previous song, 293, Out of Need and Out of Custom, a couple things I'll note for you. One, if we look all the way down at the bottom, because now we've realized, all the juicy details about these hymns are at the bottom, not the text, not the notes. It's down here. You'll see on this one, words and music, Ken Bedima, 1972. That's an example where the individual who wrote the hymn text also wrote the song that it goes with. He or the hymnal writers titled this hymn tune Gathering. It's also an 8787D. Also below that 8787D, you see a little mathematical equation. Quarter note equals 88 to 96. That's a tempo indication. That is, you get your metronome out, you set it to 88, somewhere between 88 and 96. That's how fast your quarter note wants to go. So some certain hymns in here have that little metronome marking, and that can give you a sense of how fast or how slow to play a piece of music. You can also always ignore it. Getting back to 294, here we gather as God's people. Underneath the 8787D on this one, no metronome marking, but I do have, it says harmonization number 16. Well, gosh, let's go turn to number 16 and see what's going on. So if we turn to number 16 in our hymnal, we get to, hey, one of my favorite hymns, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. And in fact, that is the hymn that I personally associate with a Nettleton. And I know for me that there are certain hymn tunes that are very, very strongly tied into a very, very specific hymn text. And so certain ones I'm really good about learning and remembering. I love Nettleton. I love Beach Spring. But then I always have to look it up. Well, I'll get to that in 1 second. But we get to here, 16, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. You see, oh, wow, now we've got a treble clef and a bass clef. Now we've got all these notes for Brian to play. And that's how we get the chords to sing over top of. Also, as a singer, when you get all these notes like this, we saw the previous one, 294, was just one note. So we all just sang the melody together. And you are always welcome and encouraged to sing the melody. It's the best part of the song. A lot of people think. There's also great harmonizations opportunities. And so, typically in a choral setting, and a lot of hymns are notated in what's called SATB voicing. What are those letters? Soprano, alto, tenor, bass. So the soprano is the highest voice. And it's a term that's used in a number of different places. There are certain singers are sopranos. Back when we had our choir, it was the folks over on that side. Noreen and Lisa would sit over there, and they would sing the highest notes. The altos sing lower notes than the sopranos. And when we had our choir, they would sing along the back row there. Iva was one of my lovely altos. They sing lower notes than the sopranos. Typically, sopranos and altos are either young boy voices or women voices. We also have tenor and bass parts. And tenors are male voices that sing on a higher pitch, and basses are male voices that sing lower. And so many people, we've all sung at some point in our life, we've all sung along with different music, whether we're singing in church congregationally or singing along with our car radio. And I'm sure you've found that you're more successful at some times than others in terms of singing along. I remember when I was a kid growing up thinking, wow, I really wish I could sing along with Freddie Mercury, but dang, he gets way up there. I think most people wish they could and very few could. But I learned at a young age that I was not a tenor and more of the bass baritone. So you might find when you're singing in church that, gosh, this song is like sitting really high. Maybe I should try singing the tenor part. Well, the tenor part is what we find in the bass clef, the top notes. The bass part is in the bass clef, the bottom notes. The soprano part is in the treble clef, the top notes. And the alto part is in the treble clef, the lower notes. So if you're a woman and you're like, this note's getting a little high for me, let me track this alto part right here and sing along with that. Now, if I'm looking at Come Thou Fount, in that very, very first measure, or rather the first complete measure, right where you see the word fount, you see that in the treble clef, there's one note. But it's got a stems going both ways. It's got two stems on it. How come? Because both the sopranos and the altos are going to sing that note all together. So this SATB harmonization enables different voices to cover different parts, and then collectively, all those voices can come together and sing chords and sing harmonies. What can also be very, very fun about exploring hymn tunes and the meters is that's what enables us to mix and match. What do I mean by that? Well, we're going to sing Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. You're going to stay right there, and we're going to sing the first line of Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, or the first verse, rather, of Come Thou Fount. Here we go. Come Thou Fount of every blessing, to my heart to sing thy praise. Stream of mercy never ceasing, all the songs of love's praise. Teach me song, the glorious song, sung love that one, but sometimes it's fun to change it up a little bit. So what I can do is I can turn, and keep your finger there, because we're going to sing these words again, but we're going to do it a little differently. And if I turn to page number 840 in my hymnal, I get a very different index. I'm sure many of us have flipped all the way to the back, and there's the hymn index, and you can look up your favorite hymn and find it. But there's a number of other indexes in this hymnal. One of them is the index of tune names. That's at 840. And then if I go back a few before that, I get to 835, the metrical index. And so I'm going to actually turn to the metrical index, and what I'm going to look for is 8787D. And where I find it is on page 837, 8787D. And you'll see there's a chunk of a big group of hymns there that fall in there. And one that jumps out to me is Hymn to Joy, number 2. So what you're going to do is you're going to stay with number 16, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. But we're going to sing it to Hymn to Joy. Now it's tricky. It can play with your brain a little bit to not fall into joyful text when we're singing that one. But that kind of worked. Gosh, well, let me try a different one. Let's see if I can make it work somewhere else. So I'm going to turn this time again. Find my 8787D when we do. Oh, Beach Spring. That's one of my favorites. Lovely. So I'm going to play Beach Spring. You're going to sing Come Thou Fount again. And I'm going to play Beach Spring. That was pretty fun. I'm going to do one more. 8787D, and that's going to get me to, I'm pretty sure, yep, Ebenezer, another favorite of mine, especially because one of my favorite lines in Come Thou Fount is not in our hymnal, and it's Here I Raise Mine Ebenezer. So we might as well sing it to the tune, Ebenezer. Let's see if this one works. There it is. How do you like that one, Jane? Yeah, that was right up your alley, wasn't it, Jane? Yeah. So it's a great example how it kind of worked, right? Like I had a note for my words. The tone was all wrong. It didn't quite add up. But so you can't. It was one of those great examples where in music you can never say always, and you got to always avoid saying never, because a lot of times you can kind of mix and match and play around. But sometimes you run into something you're like it worked, but it was awfully silly. So I don't think I'm going to do that. What were you going to say, Chris?
That
Yes.
If you just played that, I would sing the song, Some Great God's Not a New Messiah.
Yep.
That's the words I learned to that tune.
Exactly.
So who figured this out?
Who figured out like counting up syllables and matching things?
Who figured out in its index that a certain song could be sung with different,
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about how poetry is written, for many, many countless centuries, poetry has been written in meter, right? And there's different types of meter, and different forms of poetry have, and a lot of poetic meter is based on syllable count, right? That's one way that we sort of define our cadences. And so that's what they really kind of clung on to with this. And again, when you have the same number of syllables, or darn close to it, again, you will find where sometimes you'll see, as I said before, sometimes power is one syllable, sometimes it's two, sometimes it's written as one, but I end up singing it as two with eighth notes because that's just, it kind of fits that way for me. So there's little ways to kind of tweak things to kind of make them match. And then other times where, you know what, that didn't work. Oh well, it was a fun experiment, but I'm not going to do a Come Thou Fount Ebenezer anytime soon.
but it's the writer of the hymn who decides what else fits? Is it the hymnal publication?
It'll vary. Yeah, it'll vary. And sometimes you will find they will mention alternate hymn tunes. They'll even suggest, oh, you could do this. Some of these hymns, as I said before, the hymn is the text. It's the words that we're singing. And so you might pick up a different hymnal and find the same hymn text with a different musical setting. And so there's you know, when groups are putting together hymnals and they're big, it's big committee type organizations that will put a hymnal together. Those are some of the decisions that they're making within that. But again, what's wonderful is them adding and offering this metric index and a list of the hymn tunes. By defining them, you know, early on we think, I got to look it up now. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah. That's one of, like, I love that hymn tune, and to me it's just that, and I know it has a real, I know it's got a hymn name, and I think it's like one of the weird ones, CWM Rhonda or something. It's not that though. It is CWM Rhonda. Look at that, nailed it. 622. Where did CWM Rhonda come from? I don't know. I'd have to look, and someone might know, but there's also many examples where people don't know. There are lots and lots of examples. In fact, one of the ones that we sung, our hymn of response today, blanking on it, was 580. Lord, I want to be a Christian, 589. If you turn to 589, a couple fun things that you'll see here. One, you'll see that the hymn tune is, I want to be a Christian. So this hymn is what defined this hymn tune. They named it after this text. You'll also see that under where you'd normally see the meter, like the numbers, it says IRR, which means irregular. So that the pacing on that one is unique and is one because it is, by denoting that's irregular, they're kind of saying, yeah, you can't like monkey with, it's not going to fit. It's going to be a square peg in a round hole situation. But if you look underneath by where we saw before composers, you'll see this one, African American spiritual, is the words. So they don't know who wrote the words. We just know it came from that tradition. Music, African American spiritual. Again, we have no idea an individual who composed it, but we know it came from a tradition. And then after that, you'll see harm, which is not that he harmed it, but he harmonized it. Larry Civis, 1993. So probably around the time they were putting this hymnal together-ish, they're like, oh, we want to include this one. It's just a melody. And they're like, Larry, can you do us a favor and make some chords out of this? And Larry's like, I'm on it. And Larry came up with all the other notes. So the hymn tune is what's in the soprano part. And typically in hymnals, the sopranos predominantly get the melodies. And everyone underneath, the altos, tenors, and basses, provide the harmony. They provide the other voices that make up the chords. Occasionally, if we turn to song number 2, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, because I played that one earlier, and it's the first one that came to my mind, is a special example where sometimes the sopranos are like, man, everyone gets cool harmony parts except for us. And then composers are like, all right, we have to placate these sopranos. So we write for them what's called a descant. So if you look at Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, you'll see up above, there's this little, it's like a smaller treble clef. And it just has the words for the fourth verse, mortals join the happy chorus. And if you look, the notes are higher than the other notes below it. You know, not just higher on the page, but if you kind of look at which lines and spaces they're on, they get up there. That's what's called a descant. And it's when the sopranos kind of go rogue and sing something way up in the stratosphere. Everyone else keeps doing the song as we've been doing it, but they've got this whole solo thing going on there. And that's an example of what's a descant. And you'll see those sometimes. And again, that term descant, it's when the sopranos go up. One of those very, very typical terms there. Does all that make sense?
Brian,
Yes.
are hymnals universal?
In what sense?
Methodist?
No, they often have denominational ties. It'll be a committee from a specific denomination will create a new hymnal. So there are hymnals that come from the Reformed tradition. I know I've got probably like 6 or 8 hymnals at home. Basically any church I've been at, I just steal one. Borrow. But you will find, as I was saying before, you will find that from one hymnal to the next, you might find some of the same hymns. They might be in a different key. One of them might be a little bit higher, a little bit lower. They might use a different hymn tune entirely. It might be like, oh, wow, in this hymnal, we sing this song completely differently. One of the things that I always make a point, I played music for the focus service at First Church. And when I got there, I was like, one of the first questions I had for Mashana, what's your doxology? Because every church might do it a little different. It was really nice. They do the same one as us, so that was very, very familiar. But it's one where certain people. Well, they're rushing through it. Yeah, some of them don't hang on to the flow the way that we do. There's other ones where my previous church of mine, where we used. An entirely different hymn tune. So not just like a variation on Old Hundredth, but an entirely different hymn tune. Still for the doxology text, though. So you will find that they're not universal, and definitely specific denominations will make decisions on which hymns they include and some of the text and the language based on their belief system. So, Jane.
Do you pick the hymns after you know what the sermon is?
After I know what the scripture is, yeah, I always make a point to connect with the minister, and Pastor Chris and Reverend Paulberg here are good about giving me a heads up of what we're doing. And I really make an effort to, like, I read the scripture and I study it, and I try my best to find music that relates to and ties in. Sometimes it works better than others. You know, some scripture, like, nobody wants to write a hymn about. And other ones, everyone wants to. Like, we've got all this great Christmas music that we basically get like 1 day to 1 month of the year that we can use. But it's a really popular time for composers. Everyone wants to write Christmas music. We need some more Lenten hymn writers. That's what's really missing. I guess no one's feeling terribly inspired by giving up. Question?
It's very simple. Is the tune name the first known original tune?
Good question. You will find that they vary quite a bit, and it often will depend on if they know the source of the tune. Again, the more like Nettleton, I don't think that they have any idea who composed Nettleton, and I don't know where that name specifically came from. I'd have to.
There's a song called Nettleton.
What's that?
So there's not a song.
Not that I'm aware of, but maybe there was, or maybe it was just an old instrumental tune from sort of traditional melody, and maybe it was the way that we sing "What Child Is This?" The tune is Greensleeves, and Greensleeves, like, that's the name of that tune, and it was a melody there.
So where do they come from?
A lot of them, again, so certain ones, our closing hymn today was Robert Schumann. I was like, oh, look at that. Robert Schumann wrote the melody. And it mentioned that it was adapted. So they took a piece by Schumann, or Schubert. I'd have to go back and look. And then they took a melody from it, and like, oh, I really like that melody. I want to sing words to that melody. Other times they'll use music from Bach, and it might be from a sacred piece that he wrote. It might be from a cantata or another piece that he wrote. Other ones are, again, there's a world, people have been doing music for much longer than people have been recording music or notating it. And so there's a huge world of folk music out there, and tunes that have been shared among one another through the oral tradition for centuries and generations of people. And so at some point, someone kind of wrote it down and sort of came up with, a standardization for it, but you'll also find variations within those. I mean, Greensleeves is a great example of that. I prefer the Dorian. But in our hymnal, I think that's such a weak movement. I think I prefer the Dorian C sharp, the raised sixth. But that's something where, again, with it being a folk music from an oral tradition, there's not one that's right or wrong. It's just that different people have taken this, and so a lot of these songs have been kind of in the world, and people will draw upon them. So there's
Will come from some original tune or
sometimes they do, but sometimes we don't know where that source is necessarily. Yeah.
not like a made-up name.
Yeah, and again, it's who often I wonder sometimes, especially like there's some songs in here by Brian Wren. Oh, I'll mention another index. So I mentioned the hymn tune index and the metric index. There's also composer index, which can be really, really lovely. If you're looking for music by a certain specific writer or composer, if I do that, I'm just going to look up Brian Wren because he's someone who wrote music more contemporarily. Song number 10. So the music, big number 10, Bring Many Names. Brian Wren wrote the words, Carlton Young wrote the music in the same year as him, but then the music says West Chase. I'd have to go back and look and see, did they give it that name, West Chase? Did that exist somewhere else? Did the hymn, people putting the hymn together just kind of came up with that title? But, so again, certain ones are very, very standardized, but then other ones are a bit more. Chris?
This is a clef question. Can one song have the treble clef with sharps and the bass clef with flats?
Nope, doesn't really happen. You can do anything. You will find that in music, it's the 21st century. Music is always about creating these expectations and then bucking trends. Coming up with we're going to do this and then changing course. If we all kept doing the same thing, it would be boring. So people keep kind of changing stuff up. And so I've played music. That was a song, Maron Niggin maybe. I used to play with a friend he's actually a cantor at a Jewish temple up in Montreal. And he had a wedding band that I played with sometimes, and we did a lot of Israeli music and a lot of klezmer music. And that specific one had a clef, and I remember on the gig just being like, whoa, it kind of caught me by surprise. It had 2 flats and 1 sharp. F sharp, B flat, E flat was the clef for that. And it puts you in that mode. And again, when you play this, if I play this for an 8-year-old piano student, they said, oh, it sounds like Egypt, it sounds like Arabia, it sounds like Aladdin. And that mode is all throughout klezmer music. So in our Western tradition, a key signature with flats and sharps is very, very weird. And that's, again, it caught my eye. The second I saw it, I was like, that makes perfect sense. Because if you don't do it and you only put the 2 flats, you got to put sharps on every single F. If you just put the F sharp, you got to put flats on every B and E all the whole way. It's very consistent unto itself that way. Ginny.
I just don't along with what she's talking about. You can interchange 3 flats and 4 sharps, You could play a hymn in 3 flats by playing it in 4 sharps, you know that.
Yes.
Okay. One Sunday, to answer her question, I played the first verse in 3 flats, and I had practiced it both ways, and between verses I forgot which key I was using on the first verse. Can you turn to page 218 that has 3 flats? Can you do your left hand in 3 flats and your right hand in 4 sharps and let them hear what's going on? Because the congregation was singing in my first verse.
Which number you want?
218 is one.
218?
Yeah, if you could do one hand in 3 flats and the other.
Let me see. I like a challenge. You know I like a challenge. That's a real tricky one. If you just did both hands in all the flats and then both hands in the sharps, that's a lovely modulation. Because then you go from being consistent. Oh boy, modulation! I love that, especially going to the third verse. Pump it up by a half step. We all get excited by that. Doing one in each. That's a. Thank you for that, Ginny. You broke me a little bit. I've talked way too long. I apologize for that. I've kept you all too long. Are there any final questions? And by all means, let this be an introduction into this, and hopefully we got a few different ideas and things to think about. If you ever have any requests, hopefully a little bit more tonal than Ginny's, bring them my way. And you know, obviously I ran long because I just love geeking out on this stuff. So thank you all for coming and being a part of this. Have a great Sunday.